My name is Catherine. I thought I was living a quiet, peaceful life here on the lake. A life I had earned. I thought my son had found the perfect wife, that my first grandchild was a blessing that would complete our family. I was wrong. I was dangerously wrong. What I'm about to tell you is a story of deception so deep, so monstrous, that it nearly destroyed everything I hold dear. It started with a single horrifying act I witnessed from my own kitchen window. I watched my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, drag a heavy suitcase to the water's edge. But it was the faint, muffled sound from within that turned my blood to ice. I raced to pull it out, and what I found inside didn't just stop my heart. It shattered my entire world and exposed a nightmare I never could have imagined. This story is a warning. Before we dive in, please support our channel, Ken's Story, by hitting that subscribe button, giving this video a thumbs up, and letting me know in the comments. Have you ever had a terrible feeling about someone that you just couldn't shake? Trust me, after hearing this, you'll never ignore that feeling again. The air here on Lake Bemidji has a special kind of stillness, especially in the autumn. The scent of pine needles and damp earth hangs heavy, and the only sounds are usually the lonely call of a loon across the water or the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. This house, the one my late husband Robert and I built with our own hands, was supposed to be my sanctuary. For 5 years since he passed, it had been just that. A place of quiet reflection, of predictable, comforting routines. My life was measured by the changing seasons on the water, and I was content with that. I thought the most excitement I'd ever see again was the annual ice fishing derby. That all changed when my son, Harry, and his wife Rebecca, moved into the guest cabin on my property. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, just to help them get on their feet after their baby, my beautiful granddaughter Julia, was born. Seeing Harry as a father, it filled a space in my heart I thought would always be empty. He was a natural, so full of love, so completely devoted. He looked at Rebecca as if she'd single-handedly hung the moon and stars, and his happiness became my own. I wanted nothing more than to see my son's life be as perfect as he believed it to be. And on the surface, it truly was perfect. Rebecca was everything a mother could want for her son. She was beautiful, intelligent, and seemed to adore Harry with every fiber of her being. She managed their small household with an effortless grace that I, admittedly, never quite possessed. She was a polished surface, smooth and flawless, without a single crack to be seen. But that's what was so unsettling. Sometimes, when I'd look at her, I felt like I was seeing a reflection of a person, not the person herself. Her smiles didn't always reach her eyes. Her stories about her childhood in Oregon, about the family inheritance that allowed them to live without financial stress, were always just a little too vague. She'd mention a detail one week, the name of a street, a childhood friend, and a completely different one a month later. When I gently pointed out, she would just laugh, a light, tinkling sound, and blame it on a poor memory. Harry would just smile and wrap his arm around her, completely captivated. I told myself I was being ridiculous. That I was turning into the cliché I swore I'd never become, the suspicious, overbearing mother-in-law. Who was I to question their happiness? Harry was a grown man, and he was ecstatically in love. So, I pushed my doubts down, burying them deep. I focused on little Julia, on her tiny hands and sleepy sighs. I poured all my energy into being a doting grandmother and a supportive mother. I chose to believe in the beautiful picture they painted, this perfect family in the cozy cabin by the lake. It was a choice I would come to regret more than anything else in my life. Because the truth, I would soon learn, wasn't just hidden. It was submerged, waiting in the cold, dark water just beyond my back door. That particular afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised plums, hanging low and heavy over the landscape. The usual cheerful birdsong was replaced by an oppressive silence, the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The lake itself, usually sparkling and alive, looked like a sheet of hammered steel, cold and unwelcoming. I was standing at my kitchen sink, looking out the large picture window as I often did, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water. It was a simple domestic task, a moment of peace in a day that felt increasingly gloomy. I was thinking about Harry and little Julia, wondering if I should bring them over some freshly baked cookies, when a flash of movement from the guest cabin caught my eye. It was Rebecca. But this was not the poised, graceful woman I was used to seeing. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as she wrestled the cabin door open and began to drag something heavy outside. It was a large, dark, scuffed-up suitcase, the kind you'd see on an airport carousel, meant for long journeys. I'd never seen it before. She didn't use the wheels. She was half dragging, half carrying it across the damp ground, her arms straining with the effort. Her head was on a swivel, her eyes darting back and forth from the dense pine forest on her left to my own house on her right. She was acting like a hunted animal. Her hair, usually swept into an elegant knot, had come loose and whipped across her face in the rising wind. My first thought was one of utter confusion. What on earth was she doing? Perhaps she was just throwing out old, ruined clothes, maybe something that had gotten mildewed in the damp cabin air. But that didn't make any sense. The county dump was only a 10-minute drive away. This felt different. This felt clandestine, secretive. I watched, my hands frozen in the dishwater, as she struggled down the slight incline of the lawn that led to our small private dock. Every few feet, she would stop, her chest heaving, and scan her surroundings again with that same frantic paranoia. When she finally reached the wooden planks of the dock, she dropped the suitcase with a heavy thud. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring down at it. Then, she looked directly toward my house, and for one heart-stopping second, I was certain our eyes met through the glass. I instinctively shrank back behind the curtain, my heart pounding in my chest. When I dared to peek out again, she was moving with a terrifying resolve. She grabbed the handle of the suitcase, dragged it to the very edge of the dock, and with a final violent shove that seemed to take all of her strength, she pushed it over the side. There was no splash, not really. Just a deep, sickening gulp as the dark water of the lake swallowed it whole. It didn't bob on the surface or drift. It simply vanished, sinking with a horrifying finality into the murky depths. Rebecca stood there for another moment, her arms limp at her sides, staring at the spot where the ripples were already beginning to fade. Then, without a single look back, she turned and practically ran back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind her. I just stood there, my knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the sink, my mind unable to process the sheer wrongness of it all. It was an act of disposal. An act of finality. But what, my soul screamed in silence, what in God's name was inside? For how long I stood there, I can't say. Seconds. Minutes. Time seemed to warp and stretch, leaving me trapped in a single horrifying tableau. My hands were still in the now cold dishwater, my gaze fixed on that spot on the lake, as if I could somehow force the suitcase to reappear through sheer willpower. My mind was a maelstrom, a chaotic storm of impossible explanations and terrifying questions. I tried to reason with myself, to find a logical thread to pull on that would unravel this whole nightmare and turn it back into a normal, dreary afternoon. Maybe it was just trash, I told myself again. Heavy, worthless junk. Old books, broken electronics, things that were too much of a hassle to haul to the dump. People do strange things. Yes, that had to be it. Rebecca was a private person, perhaps a little eccentric. She didn't want to be judged for what she was throwing away. I clung to that thought like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. It was flimsy, it made no sense, but it was better than the alternative that was lurking in the dark corners of my mind. The image of her face, the frantic, hunted look in her eyes, kept flashing behind my own. That wasn't the look of someone doing a bit of convenient housekeeping. That was the look of pure, unadulterated desperation. I thought of Harry, of his bright, trusting smile. I thought of sweet, innocent Julia, sleeping soundly in her crib, completely unaware. This couldn't be their life. This darkness couldn't be connected to them. My daughter-in-law was not some kind of monster. I was being hysterical, letting my imagination, my quiet, lonely life, run away with me. The ripples on the water had almost completely vanished. The lake was returning to its placid, steel-gray state. I took a deep breath, ready to dismiss the entire episode, to force it from my mind. And that's when I heard it. It was faint, so faint that at first, I thought I'd imagined it, that it was just the wind whistling around the eaves of the house. I tilted my head, straining to listen over the pounding in my own ears. Silence. And then, there it was again. It wasn't the wind. It was a sound that was being smothered, choked. A thin, frantic whimper, followed by a dull, rhythmic thudding. It was a desperate plea, swallowed by water and distance, but it was undeniably real. It was the sound of something fighting. Every ridiculous excuse my mind had constructed evaporated in an instant. The flimsy driftwood of logic I'd been clinging to was ripped away by a tidal wave of pure, cold horror. Suitcase. Heavy. Secret. A sound. A living sound. The pieces didn't just click into place. They slammed together with the force of a car crash, and the reality of the situation stole the breath from my lungs. My entire body went rigid. It felt as if the lake's icy water had been injected directly into my veins. The time for thinking was over. The time for denial was a luxury I could no longer afford. Something was in that suitcase. Something was alive. And I had stood here paralyzed, while it was running out of air. With a strangled gasp, I ripped my hands from the sink, sending water splashing across the floor. I didn't grab a coat. I didn't even think to dry my hands. I just ran. The screen door slammed shut behind me with a crack that echoed in the unnerving silence. I didn't feel the sharp bite of the autumn wind on my face or the damp chill of the earth beneath my slippers. All I felt was a singular, explosive purpose that propelled me forward. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't slow down. The familiar, gentle slope of my backyard became a treacherous obstacle course I scrambled down with reckless abandon. When my feet hit the muddy shoreline, I didn't hesitate. The shock of the freezing lake water was a distant, secondary sensation. My reality had narrowed to a single, desperate objective. That spot on the water, that placid surface that was hiding an unspeakable secret. My mind, somehow, was working with a terrifying clarity. Diving in was suicide. The water was deep and dangerously cold. I needed a tool. My eyes darted to the old boathouse, its gray wood weathered by years of Minnesota winters. The boat hook. Robert's old, long-poled boat hook. I wrenched the swollen wooden door open, my nails splintering against the rough plank. It was there, hanging on its usual set of hooks. I grabbed it, its cold metal a solid, grim reality in my trembling hands, and plunged back into the water, wading out until the icy waves were soaking the hem of my sweater. Then began the most agonizing minutes of my entire existence. I cast the hook out, dragging it blindly along the muddy lake bed. The metal hook scraped against rocks and snagged on sunken weeds, each false catch sending a jolt of sickening hope and immediate despair through my body. I worked in a frantic rhythm, casting and dragging, my breath coming in ragged, desperate sobs. Time had ceased to exist. There was only the cold, the fear, and the rhythmic scrape of metal on silt. With every failed attempt, the image of that sinking suitcase burned brighter in my mind, a coffin descending into the abyss. After what felt like an eternity, the hook snagged on something solid, something with the unmistakable shape and unyielding weight of what I was looking for. The struggle to bring it to shore was a primal battle. The waterlogged suitcase fought me with an incredible weight, the mud of the lake bed creating a powerful suction. My arms screamed in protest, my back felt like it would snap, but I pulled, inch by agonizing inch, dragging my horrifying prize from its watery grave. When I finally heaved it onto the muddy bank, it landed with a wet, heavy squelch. For a moment, I could only stand over it, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably from cold and adrenaline. The zipper was jammed with mud and grit. My fingers were numb and useless, fumbling with the metal tab. A raw, animalistic sound of frustration escaped my throat, and I put all of my weight, all of my terror, into one final, desperate yank. The zipper gave way with a sound like tearing fabric. I threw the lid open. My mind had prepared for the worst, but I was wrong. There is no way to prepare for something like this. The first thing I saw was a tangle of dark, soaked blankets. They were cheap, unfamiliar patterns, nothing like the soft pastels I'd bought for Julia. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached in with shaking hands and peeled back the top layer. And there it was. A tiny, perfect face, pale as porcelain, with lips tinged a terrifying shade of blue. The baby was terrifyingly still. But as I watched, its tiny chest gave a faint, shuddering rise, followed by a weak, shallow gasp. It was alive. Barely, miraculously, alive. In that instant, a single devastating truth seared itself into my soul, obliterating every other thought. My son's wife, the mother of my grandchild, had tried to drown a child. It wasn't just a suitcase. It wasn't just trash. It was a tomb. And the monster who had sent it there was just 100 yards away, likely pretending to be asleep. My rage was a living thing, a roaring fire in my chest that should have propelled me to the phone to call the police, to bring the full weight of the law down upon the monster living under my roof. But my body wouldn't obey. My first, overriding instinct was for the tiny, fragile life in my arms. The baby had started to make small, mewling sounds, its body trembling with a deep, shuddering cold. Without a second thought, I tore off my own soaking wet cardigan and wrapped it tightly around the infant, bundling it against my chest to share my own body heat. Holding this impossible, miraculous child, I turned and began the long walk back to the cabin. It wasn't a run this time. It was a slow, deliberate march. Each step was heavy, measured, the wet ground squelching beneath my feet. The cozy little cabin, which I had always seen as a haven for my son, now looked like a predator's den. I didn't knock. I threw the door open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall. Rebecca was standing by the small kitchen counter, a mug in her hand, a look of casual annoyance on her face that instantly morphed into a mask of pure shock. "Catherine. My God, you're soaked. What on earth happened to you?" she began, her voice a perfect imitation of wifely concern. But her performance was cut short. I took 2 steps into the room, the cold air swirling around me, and held out the small, shivering bundle in my arms. Her eyes locked onto the baby, and every trace of color drained from her face. The mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. "Explain this," I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury I had never before known. "Explain this right now, Rebecca." For a moment, she was silent, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. Then, the facade didn't just crack, it completely disintegrated. A horrifying, animalistic wail tore from her throat, and she collapsed to the floor, her body racked with violent, theatrical sobs. "No, no, no," she gasped, crawling towards me on her hands and knees. "He said it would be okay. He promised." I recoiled from her touch, holding the baby tighter. "Who promised, Rebecca? Who are you talking about?" I demanded. Through a flood of tears and choked breaths, the story came tumbling out. A story of a dangerous man from a past she had tried to escape. A man named Marco. A story of a debt, a mistake she made as a foolish young woman that had come back to haunt her. "It's not Julia," she shrieked, her eyes wide and pleading. "I swear to you, Catherine, on my life, that is not our baby. Julia is safe, she's in her crib, she's sleeping." She claimed this Marco had shown up a week ago, threatening her. He had forced her to take this other baby as part of some criminal transaction that had gone wrong, a package he needed to get rid of. He had told her that if she didn't obey, if she didn't dispose of the evidence, he would come for Harry. He would take Julia from them, and they would never see her again. "He told me what to do," she sobbed, clutching at the hem of my pants. "He said it was the only way to protect our family, to protect Harry. Please, Catherine, you have to believe me. Please don't call the police. If you do, he'll kill us all." My mind was reeling. Every instinct, every fiber of my being, was screaming that this was a lie, a desperate, manipulative performance. But the sliver of fear she had planted in my heart was terrifyingly real. The mention of a threat to Harry, to Julia. It was a poison dart that found its mark. My rage was screaming at me to expose her, but that tiny, potent seed of fear was a cold hand gripping my heart, whispering for me to wait. And in that moment of hesitation, the first thread of her tangled, venomous web began to wrap itself around me. My mind was a courtroom in chaos. Every piece of damning evidence was laid bare before me. The frantic behavior, the sunken suitcase, the living, breathing child in my arms who was now the victim of a clear and monstrous crime. My intuition, a voice I had learned to trust over 67 years of life, was the prosecutor, screaming a single unwavering verdict: liar, manipulator, monster. It demanded justice. It demanded a call to the police, an end to this madness before it could fester any further. But then, another voice rose to the defense. It was a quieter voice, colder and far more terrifying. It was the voice of fear. What if? What if, by some impossible twisted logic, she was telling the truth? What if there really was a Marco? What if a single phone call to the authorities would sign a death warrant for my son and my granddaughter? See for yourself, Catherine, Rebecca pleaded from the floor, her voice choked with tears. Go on, look. Julia is fine. She's safe. Her words were a direct challenge to my conviction. Leaving the rescued baby on a clean patch of the sofa, still wrapped in my cardigan, I walked, my legs feeling like lead, toward the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. Each step was a battle between my rage and that insidious, creeping fear. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. There, in the soft glow of a nightlight, was the crib. And inside, a small form was sleeping peacefully under a pink blanket. I crept closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a baby, all right. A healthy, sleeping baby with a wisp of dark hair, looking for all the world exactly like my Julia. I stared for a long time, searching for something, anything, out of place. But in my frantic state of mind, I saw nothing but the perfect image of my granddaughter. The sight of that sleeping child didn't calm me. It fractured me. It made Rebecca's story just plausible enough to be paralyzing. I walked back into the main room, my face a cold, unreadable mask. Rebecca looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and hope. I looked down at her, then at the shivering infant on my sofa. My decision was made, not out of trust, but out of a terror so profound it felt like a physical illness. Get up, Rebecca, I said, my voice devoid of all warmth. Stop crying. Your tears mean nothing to me right now. She scrambled to her feet. I don't believe you, I said, the words as hard and cold as stones. But on the 1 in a million chance that my son's life is actually in danger, I will give you this. 24 hours. Her eyes widened. You have 24 hours to solve your problem with this, Marco. After that, I am walking into the police station. With or without you. Do you understand me? She nodded furiously, a wave of sickening relief washing over her face. My focus then shifted to the immediate crisis. This child needs a doctor, I stated, moving toward the sofa. I found a dry, clean baby blanket in Julia's nursery bag and gently rewrapped the rescued infant. I'm taking her. You will stay here. You will not call Harry. You will not leave this cabin. You will do nothing until you hear from me. I scooped the baby into my arms. She felt impossibly light. The drive into the next town was a blur of dark roads and swirling thoughts. I found what I was looking for. A small, 24-hour urgent care clinic, its fluorescent lights a lonely beacon in the night. As I walked through the automatic doors, the nurse at the front desk looked up with tired eyes. I held the baby a little closer, took a deep breath, and let the first lie fall from my lips. Please, you have to help, I said, my voice trembling for an entirely new reason. I found her. On the side of the road, wrapped in my cardigan. It was the first lie I had to tell to protect my family, and as I handed the innocent child over to the nurse, I had the sinking feeling it would not be the last. Rebecca's world was built on secrets, and now I was standing in the doorway, forced to help her keep them. The drive back from the clinic was a journey through a fog of disbelief and dread. The baby was safe, for now, in the sterile fluorescent world of medicine, a Jane Doe in their system. But I was driving back into the heart of the darkness. The 24-hour deadline I had given Rebecca felt less like an ultimatum and more like a ticking time bomb I had foolishly strapped to my own chest. What was I expecting? That in one day, some shadowy villain named Marco would simply vanish and our lives would snap back to normal? The thought was absurd. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I could not simply sit by my window and wait for that clock to run out. Passivity was a luxury I could no longer afford. If Rebecca was telling the truth, I needed proof. And if she was lying, I needed a weapon. When I pulled into my driveway, the main house was dark, and so was the guest cabin. A sliver of moonlight cut through the clouds, illuminating the small SUV Rebecca drove, parked near the edge of the woods. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was my chance. She would be asleep, or at least pretending to be, exhausted from her ordeal. Taking the keys from my ignition, I moved with a stealth I didn't know I possessed, my slippers making barely a whisper on the gravel. Every rustle of leaves in the trees sounded like a gunshot, every snap of a twig like a scream. I felt like a criminal on my own property, and in a way, I suppose I was. I was about to cross a line, to break a bond of trust that I now suspected had never truly existed in the first place. I reached the car and my hand hesitated over the handle. I expected it to be locked, to be thwarted before I even began. But when I pulled, the door opened with a soft, almost silent click. She had been in too much of a hurry. I slipped into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of vanilla air freshener and old coffee filling the small space. It felt so normal, so mundane, it was almost sickening. I didn't turn on the interior light, using only the weak glow from my phone screen to guide me. The glove compartment held nothing but insurance papers and fast food napkins. Under the seats, I found only a few stray toys of Julia's. My search was methodical, desperate. I was about to give up, to retreat back to my house and admit defeat, when I decided to check the trunk. I popped the latch from inside, the sound echoing unervingly in the quiet night. In the back, there was only a folded stroller and a spare blanket. But then I saw it, the small pull tab for the compartment that held the spare tire. My breath hitched. I lifted the carpeted panel. And there, tucked beside the spare tire, was a small canvas bag. It wasn't large, but it felt heavy with secrets. My fingers, numb with cold and anticipation, unzipped it. Inside were three things. The first was a cheap, plastic burner phone, the kind you buy for cash and throw away. The second was a small black ledger, its pages filled with neat columns of dates, cryptic initials, and numbers that were far too large to be casual expenses. This wasn't a diary. It was a record book. The final items were a stack of bank receipts, held together with a paperclip. They documented a series of large cash withdrawals, thousands of dollars at a time, from an account I had never heard of. Sitting there in the cold, dark car, the pieces of her story didn't just crumble, they were obliterated. The image of the helpless, sobbing victim was replaced by something far more calculating and sinister. This wasn't the evidence of a woman being blackmailed. This was the toolkit of a woman running a business. A very dark, very secret business. The web of lies was no longer just something I was caught in. It was something I could see. And now, sitting in the darkness with her secrets in my hands, I knew I would be the one to pull on the threads until the entire rotten thing came completely undone. I didn't sleep. How could I? I spent the rest of the night in my worn armchair, the cheap plastic phone and the sinister little ledger resting on the ottoman in front of me as the first grey hints of dawn crept through my window. They were like venomous creatures, inert but potent, proof of a deep and terrifying deception. I now knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Rebecca's story was a lie. But what was the truth? The cryptic notes in the ledger were a language I couldn't understand, a map of a world I couldn't begin to navigate. The 24-hour clock I had set was ticking down, and I realized a direct confrontation with Rebecca would be useless. She was a professional liar. Confronting her with this evidence would only cause her to invent a new, more elaborate story, or worse, cause her to panic and flee. My thoughts, as they always did, turned to Harry. My kind, loving, honorable son. A terrible, desperate idea began to form in my mind. Perhaps he held a key. Not consciously, of course. But maybe, in all their conversations, Rebecca had let a name slip. A place. A small, insignificant detail that could be the Rosetta Stone to deciphering the notes in her ledger. It was a long shot, a dangerous one, but it was the only play I had. I had to try to connect with him, to probe the edges of the perfect story she had so carefully constructed for him. As if on cue, I saw him emerge from the cabin, stretching in the cool morning air before heading toward my back door for his morning coffee, just like he always did. It was a ritual I cherished, but today it filled me with a cold dread. I forced myself to move, to put the kettle on, to arrange my face into a mask of maternal warmth that felt brittle and foreign. He came in, kissed my cheek, and poured himself a mug of coffee, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. "Morning, Mom. You're up early," he said with an easy smile. I took a deep breath. "I couldn't sleep," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Harry, darling, I was just thinking about things. About you and Rebecca and the new baby." I let the sentence hang in the air for a moment. It's a lot of new expenses. I'm just so thankful Rebecca has that family inheritance to make things easier. I don't think I ever asked, was it from her mother's side of the family? Harry's smile tightened just a fraction. "Mom, why are you asking about that? You know Rebecca's past is complicated. She doesn't like to talk about it." "Oh, I know, dear," I pushed gently. "It's not that. It's just, with that much money involved, I worry. There can be legal issues, taxes. I just want to make sure you're both protected." That's when the wall went up. It was instantaneous and absolute. His posture stiffened, and he put his mug down with a sharp click. "Protected? What are you implying, Mom? That Rebecca is hiding something? That she can't handle her own affairs?" His voice had an edge I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "She is the smartest, most capable person I have ever met. The only reason we are so stable is because of her. Her family treated her horribly. She got away from them and made a life for herself. That money is hers, and she can be as private about it as she wants to be. I, for one, am proud of her for overcoming so much." He was reciting a story, a narrative that had been polished to a shine, and he believed every single word. He saw my concern not as love, but as an attack. "I don't like this," he said, his voice now cold. "I don't like you questioning my wife. She is the best thing that ever happened to me. So please, just drop it." He walked out, leaving his coffee untouched. The back door closed with a soft click, but it felt as loud as a prison gate slamming shut. I had reached out to my son for a lifeline, for a key to this nightmare. Instead, all I had done was lock the one door that had still been open to me. And in the crushing silence of my kitchen, I finally understood. I was completely, terrifyingly, alone. His anger, his absolute blind devotion to her, hurt more than I could have possibly imagined. It felt like a betrayal, even though I knew he was a victim in all of this, the most important one. But his rejection also did something else. It forged my fear into something cold, hard, and sharp: determination. As the door clicked shut behind him, I knew that my hope of finding an ally was gone. I was Julia's, and now Harry's, only line of defense. I would have to walk into the heart of this darkness alone. I went to my study, retrieved the bag from its hiding place, and laid its contents out on my solid oak dining table. The burner phone, the black ledger, the damning receipts. This was no longer just my home. It was a command center. I decided to start with the phone. It was cheap, anonymous, and felt slick and foreign in my hands. I powered it on. A lock screen appeared, demanding a 4-digit passcode. My heart sank. It could be anything. A wave of frustration washed over me, but I pushed it down, forcing myself to think like Rebecca. What would be simple? Memorable. I tried a few obvious combinations. 1-2-3-4. 0-0-0-0. Nothing. I tried Harry's birthday. Locked. Then, a chilling idea slithered into my mind. With trembling fingers, I typed in the date of Julia's birth. The screen opened instantly. I felt a profound chill seep into my bones. The key to her secret, criminal world was the birthday of the very child she was using as a shield. There was only one contact in the phone, saved under the name Logistics. The message thread was short, concise, and utterly terrifying. There were no pleasantries, no emotion, only cold, hard transactions. My eyes scanned the words, my blood running colder with each line. Package will be ready for pickup on the 10th. Payment on delivery. Client is pleased with the last asset. High quality. Flawless exchange. Have you secured the new product? Specifications are very precise this time. Payment confirmed. Proceed with disposal of the compromised unit. They spoke of children, of human babies, the way one would speak of merchandise, of inventory. Asset. Package. Product. The word that hit me the hardest was the last one I read, disposal. They weren't just selling babies, they were discarding them like faulty equipment. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick up the ledger. As I opened its stiff cover, a single folded document slipped out from between the pages. It was a birth certificate. I carefully unfolded it. The mother's name was a stranger to me, a Sarah Jenkins. The father was listed as unknown. And the baby's name was not Julia. It was a different name entirely. This single piece of paper was a grenade, blowing apart the last remaining shreds of Rebecca's blackmail story. I turned my attention to the pages of the ledger. The cryptic initials and columns that had been meaningless before now began to make a horrifying kind of sense. PU next to a date must mean pickup. PD, for payment delivered. The numbers scribbled in the margins matched the cash withdrawal receipts perfectly. This was a record of her business, stretching back nearly 2 years. This wasn't a one-time, desperate act. This was a career. I leaned back in my chair, the evidence spread before me like a funeral shroud. The suitcase wasn't about getting rid of evidence for a blackmailer. It was a disposal of a compromised unit. The baby I had pulled from that lake, the one who was now safe in a clinic, was a transaction that had gone wrong. My mind finally allowed the ugly, undeniable truth to form. This wasn't blackmail. It was a marketplace. And the product being bought and sold was babies. The scale of her monstrosity was so much larger than I could have ever imagined. I now understood what she was. But a new, far more terrible question began to claw its way into my mind. A question so horrifying I could barely allow myself to think it. I sat there at my dining table, the first rays of morning sunlight slanting across the horrifying evidence, but I felt no warmth. The word marketplace echoed in the silent room, a profane pronouncement that had redefined my world. I now understood the what of Rebecca's evil. She was a merchant in the most monstrous of trades. But as my mind churned, trying to process the sheer scale of her deception, the question that had been clawing at the edges of my consciousness finally broke through, sharp and venomous. If the baby I rescued from the lake was a compromised unit from one of her transactions, then who was the baby sleeping in the cabin? Where did that child come from? My mind recoiled from the answer that was taking shape. No, I thought, a wave of nausea washing over me. It's not possible. Even she couldn't be that depraved. She wouldn't sell her own child. Not Harry's child. I tried desperately to find another explanation. Maybe Rebecca was only a broker. Maybe she arranged these things for other people, and the baby in the cabin was truly hers, separate from the filth of her secret business. I clung to that possibility, that thin, fraying rope over a chasm of absolute horror. She was a criminal, yes, but she was still a mother. A mother loves her child. It is the most basic, fundamental law of nature. But as I sat there, arguing with myself, a memory surfaced. It was from the hospital, just a day after Julia was born. I was holding her, marveling at how tiny and perfect she was. I remember tracing the sole of her tiny foot with my finger, and I saw it. A small, unique birthmark on her left heel, shaped exactly like a perfect, tiny crescent moon. I remember smiling and mentioning it to Harry. "She'll be a little traveler," I had said, with the moon already on her foot. It was a small, insignificant detail, a fleeting moment of grandmotherly affection. But now, in the context of everything I had discovered, that memory became the most important thing in the world. It was a key. It was the one piece of physical truth that Rebecca couldn't fake or explain away with a lie. I had to know. I had to be sure. I waited, my entire body humming with a terrible nervous energy, until mid-afternoon, when I saw Rebecca leave in her SUV, likely heading into town for groceries to maintain her perfect facade. This was my chance. I slipped out of my house and walked to the cabin, my keys in my hand, letting myself in like a thief. The cabin was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I tiptoed to the nursery. There she was, the baby I thought was my granddaughter, sleeping peacefully in her crib, the very picture of innocence. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I reached in, my hands trembling, and gently, so gently, I lifted the baby's small warm leg. I angled her foot toward the light filtering through the window. I held my breath and looked at her heel. The skin was perfect. Flawless. And completely, utterly blank. There was no mark. No tiny crescent moon. In that instant, the world didn't just stop. It ended. The floor seemed to fall away from beneath my feet, and I was plunged into the chasm I had been so afraid of. The thin rope of hope I'd been clinging to had snapped. I carefully placed the baby's leg back down, my movements numb and robotic, and retreated from the cabin, a ghost in my own home. The horrifying, soul-shattering truth was now absolute. Rebecca hadn't just tried to drown a baby. She had sold her baby. She had sold Harry's daughter. She had sold my Julia. This was no longer just about exposing a crime. This was about rescuing a hostage. And I was the only one who even knew she was missing. Grief is a strange and powerful force. For an hour after I stumbled back into my house, it was a paralyzing wave that left me empty and hollowed out. My granddaughter was gone. Sold. The words were a death sentence to the world I knew. But then, another force began to rise from the ashes of my sorrow, rage. It was a pure, cold fury unlike anything I had ever felt. It burned away my tears and replaced my despair with a singular, diamond-hard purpose. I would not break. I would not crumble. I would find my Julia, and I would bring down the monsters who had taken her. The time for being a victim was over. The time for being a hunter had begun. I went back to the dining table, back to the evidence. The ledger and the phone were no longer just proof of a crime. They were a map. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that somewhere within these cryptic notes and cold transactions was the path that would lead me to my granddaughter. My late husband, Robert, had been a forensic accountant. He spent his life finding stories hidden in numbers, uncovering deception buried in spreadsheets. I had learned more from him over 40 years of marriage than I ever realized. "Follow the money, Catherine," he used to say. "It never lies." And so, with his voice echoing in my memory, I began to work. 4 hours, I sat there, poring over the neat, precise columns in Rebecca's ledger. It was a meticulous record. Too meticulous for a terrified victim. I cross-referenced the cash withdrawal receipts with dates in the message log. Then I saw it. A recurring set of numbers on the larger transaction entries. A bank routing number. It wasn't from any local bank. I didn't recognize it. Using Robert's old, secure laptop, I ran the number through a banking database. It traced back to a small, independent credit union. Not in Minnesota, but in Mesa, Arizona. My blood ran cold as I remembered one of the messages on the burner phone, confirming Mesa pickup for the 15th. This was it. This was the hub. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my mind racing. I went through the bag one more time, shaking it out, running my hands along the seams, searching for anything I might have missed. Tucked into a small zippered pocket inside was a single, folded slip of paper I had overlooked. It was a confirmation receipt for a wire transfer, dated 2 months ago. On it were 2 names. The sender, a shell corporation I didn't recognize. And the recipient, a man named Marcus Thorne. Marcus. So close to the Marco, from Rebecca's fabricated story. The audacity of it, to use a twisted half-truth, enraged me even more. She had been testing the name on me, confident I would never uncover the reality. With a name and a location, I turned to the internet. A search for Marcus Thorne, Mesa, Arizona, brought up a handful of results. But one stood out, a local news article from 3 years prior about a multi-state investigation into illegal adoptions and human trafficking. His name was mentioned as a person of interest, who had charges of fraud and conspiracy dropped due to lack of evidence. And there was a picture. A grainy, low-resolution mugshot. The man staring back at me had cold, empty eyes and a thin, cruel smile. This was him. This was the contact, logistics. He wasn't a scary blackmailer pressuring a helpless woman. He was a professional criminal. And he was Rebecca's partner. The entire picture snapped into horrifying focus. Rebecca, with her perfect looks and charming life, was the supplier, the one who could acquire the product without suspicion. Marcus was the distributor, the one who handled the clients and the money. This wasn't a case of a woman being forced to do a terrible thing. This was a partnership. And I had just put a name and a face to the man who had helped sell my granddaughter. I didn't have to wait long. An hour later, Rebecca's SUV crunched on the gravel driveway. I watched from my window as she got out, carrying bags of groceries, the very picture of domestic normalcy. But I was no longer an observer. I was an executioner waiting for the condemned. I had already walked over to the cabin and prepared the scene. On the small dining table, I laid out the instruments of her destruction. The black ledger, open to a page of damning transactions. The burner phone, sitting next to it like a venomous insect. The other baby's birth certificate, a stark white testament to her lies. And finally, my laptop, turned on and displaying the cold-eyed mugshot of Marcus Thorne. She walked in, humming a cheerful little tune that died in her throat the instant she saw me. Her eyes darted from my face to the display on the table. The grocery bags slipped from her grasp, oranges and a carton of milk thudding onto the floor. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent pallor. The performance was over. The game was up. "Hello, Rebecca," I said, my voice unervingly calm in the quiet room. "Or perhaps I should call you Rachel. I found the name on a wire transfer receipt. It has a nice ring to it." She stared at me, her mouth agape, her mind visibly scrambling for a lie that no longer existed. "Catherine, I can explain," she stammered, her voice a pathetic whisper. "No," I cut her off, my voice as sharp and cold as shattered glass. "You are done explaining. You are done lying." I pointed to the phone. "This isn't for talking to a blackmailer. It's for talking to logistics." I tapped the ledger. "This isn't a record of your fear. It's a record of your sales." I slid the birth certificate across the table. "And this poor child's name isn't Julia. Her mother's name is Sarah Jenkins." Finally, I turned the laptop so the screen faced her directly. "And this man. This is Marcus Thorne. He isn't the man who was threatening you. He's the man you've been working with." The last bit of fight went out of her. It was a visible surrender. Her shoulders slumped, a deep, guttural sob tore from her chest, and she crumpled into a chair at the table, burying her face in her hands. The breakdown was not the theatrical performance from before. This was the ugly, genuine collapse of a cornered animal. I felt no pity. "Talk," I commanded, the single word hanging in the air like a death sentence. And so, the truth, the whole, rotten, monstrous truth, came pouring out. Her real name was Rachel Miller. She'd met Marcus years ago, and they'd been partners in crime ever since, escalating from petty fraud to this. It was her idea to get close to a good, stable man like Harry, to create the perfect cover of a loving family. Then came the confession that I had been dreading, the one that stopped the air in my lungs. She admitted she sold our Julia for $250,000. She said it was the only way to have the perfect life she'd always dreamed of, a life free from worry, a life she felt she deserved. The baby I had pulled from the lake? It was from a different transaction. The wealthy clients who had bought that child discovered it had a minor heart murmur and had angrily returned the merchandise. Marcus had told her to handle it, to make the problem disappear quietly. My attempt to save a child had simply been an interruption of her attempt to dispose of faulty goods. I listened to this litany of horrors, this confession of a soul so rotted and empty it defied comprehension, and I did not flinch. My rage had burned down to a single glowing coal of pure, cold purpose. When her pathetic sobs had subsided into shuddering breaths, I leaned forward, my voice barely a whisper, yet carrying more power than any shout. "You have told me what you did," I said. "Now you will tell me where she is. Where is my granddaughter, Rebecca? Who did you sell her to? I want a name. I want a location. Now." Rebecca looked up at me, her face a hollow mask of defeat. The last of her defiance was gone, replaced by the empty, terrified obedience of someone who knows they have absolutely no cards left to play. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy, broken whisper, devoid of all its previous charm. "The Chadwicks," she said, the name tasting like poison in her mouth. "Eleanor and Richard Chadwick. They were the clients." My entire body was a tightly wound coil of anticipation. I kept my voice low and steady, a surgeon demanding the right instrument. "Where?" "It wasn't a normal adoption," she continued, her eyes fixed on the floor. "They're powerful people. They wanted everything to be private, untraceable. The exchange was made at a private airstrip. It's about 2, maybe 3 hours north of here, up near the Canadian border." A private airstrip. The Canadian border. The scope of their operation, the wealth of their clientele, it was all more audacious than I had imagined. But then she delivered the final, devastating blow, the piece of information that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. "They aren't staying, Catherine. They have homes all over the world. This was just a pickup. Their flight is scheduled to leave." I stared at her, my heart seizing in my chest. "When, Rebecca? When does the flight leave?" She finally looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a genuine, pathetic terror. "At sunrise." Sunrise. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already evening. We had, at most, 10 hours. A wave of dizziness washed over me as I realized the horrifying truth. If I had waited, if I had honored that foolish 24-hour deal, Julia would have been gone. She would have vanished into the ether, swallowed up by the world of the ultra-rich, and we would never have seen her again. The thought galvanized me, shaking me from my shock and into action. "Get your coat," I ordered, my voice sharp and commanding. "You're coming with me." I marched her out of the cabin and across the lawn to my house. There would be no chance for her to warn Marcus, no opportunity for her to run. I took her phone, her keys, and I locked her in the small, sturdy cellar where I keep my winter preserves. It was cold and dark, but it was secure. She was my only witness, and I would not let her out of my sight. With Rebecca neutralized, I stood alone in the quiet of my kitchen, the weight of the world on my shoulders. I had a destination. I had a timeline. But I couldn't do this alone. And that meant I had to do the single hardest thing I had ever done in my life. I had to destroy my son's world. My hand was trembling as I picked up my phone and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice wary and cold after our argument that morning. "Mom. What is it?" I took a shaky breath, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "Harry. I need you to come over to the main house. Right now. Don't ask questions, just come. Something terrible has happened. It's about Rebecca. And it's about Julia." I hung up before he could respond, before I could lose my nerve. The clock was ticking. Every second that passed, My granddaughter was a second further away from me. The truth was out and the monster was caged, but the real battle, the race to save Julia, had only just begun. Harry burst through the door not 2 minutes later, his face a thunderous mask of anger and confusion. "Mom, what is this? I swear, if you're starting in on Rebecca again." His words died in his throat. He saw the scene laid out on my dining table, the same tableau of evidence that had broken his wife, and then he saw my face. In all his life, he had never seen me look the way I did in that moment. "Sit down, Harry," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. And then I told him. I laid out the entire sordid, unbelievable story, my voice flat and steady as I presented each piece of proof. I showed him the ledger, the phone, the other child's birth certificate. I made him read the cold transactional messages about the asset and the product. I watched as the anger on his face melted into disbelief, then into a desperate, pleading denial. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, you're mistaken. There has to be an explanation. Rebecca. She loves me. She loves Julia." The final, killing blow was the truth about the birthmark, and the revelation that the child he had been kissing goodnight for weeks was a stranger. When I told him that Rebecca was locked in my cellar, the last of his denial shattered, and my son, my strong, beautiful son, broke down and sobbed, his body shaking with the force of a grief so profound it physically hurt me to watch. But we had no time for grief. I knelt beside him, my hands on his shoulders. "We can fall apart later," I said, my voice hardening with purpose. "Right now, we have a job to do. We have to go get your daughter." Pulling him up, I made the call. I didn't dial 911. I called the state police barracks and asked to be put through to a detective, stating clearly that I had evidence of an active child trafficking case with a victim scheduled to be moved across the border in a matter of hours. The speed of the response was breathtaking. Within 30 minutes, 2 plainclothes detectives were in my living room. They were grim, focused, and professional. They listened to my story, examined the evidence, and briefly interviewed a sobbing, incoherent Harry. Then, they brought Rebecca up from the cellar. Seeing her in the presence of law enforcement, Harry finally saw her for what she was. Not a wife, but a common criminal. We were swept up in a whirlwind of official activity. A tactical team was mobilized. A plan was formed with swift, quiet efficiency. We were told we could come, that our presence might be needed for identification, but we were to stay out of sight until the scene was secure. The drive to the airstrip was the longest 3 hours of my life, a silent journey in the back of an unmarked police car, the dark Minnesota landscape flashing by. We arrived at a desolate access road a quarter-mile from the airstrip. In the pre-dawn gloom, we could see it, a sleek, private jet, its lights on, a luxury sedan parked beside it. My heart hammered against my ribs. We were so close. The raid was nothing like the movies. It was silent, swift, and brutal in its efficiency. Teams emerged from the darkness, surrounding the plane and the car before anyone could react. There were no gunshots, only shouted commands and the sight of 2 well-dressed older people, the Chadwicks, being pulled from the car and put in handcuffs, their faces masks of shocked indignation. It was all over in less than a minute. A female officer emerged from the jet, carrying a small, blanket-wrapped bundle. She brought the baby over to the car where we were waiting. I took the child into my arms, my entire body trembling, and the first thing I did was pull back the blanket and look at her tiny foot. There it was. The perfect, crescent moon birthmark on her heel. It was her. It was our Julia. Tears streamed down my face as I held my granddaughter for what felt like the first time. I looked over at Harry. He was staring past Julia, at the Chadwicks, the people who had bought his daughter like she was a piece of art. The full, monstrous weight of his wife's betrayal finally crashed down upon him, and in the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars, he finally, truly, understood the nightmare we had just survived. 6 months have passed. The brutal Minnesota winter has finally surrendered to a gentle spring. The ice on the lake has melted, and the water, once a cold, steel-gray mirror of my despair, now sparkles under a warm sun. I'm sitting on my porch, in the same rocking chair Robert and I used to share, but I am not alone. In my arms, a giggling, healthy Julia is reaching for a stray strand of my hair, her tiny fingers surprisingly strong. She is the center of our new, quiet world. The storm has passed, and we, the survivors, are left to rebuild among the wreckage. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive. Rebecca, or rather Rachel Miller, faced with my testimony and the mountain of evidence, took a plea deal. She will spend the next 25 years to life in a federal prison. Her partner, Marcus Thorne, was apprehended in Arizona. The information on his devices led the FBI to unravel a network that spanned 5 states. He will never be a free man again. The Chadwicks are tangled in their own legal nightmare, their name and reputation ruined. Justice, it seems, can sometimes be as cold and methodical as the crimes it seeks to punish. The other children, the baby I pulled from the lake and the one who had taken Julia's place, were entered into the system as John and Jane Doe. Their real identities are a tragic mystery, but they are safe now, and I pray for them every night, hoping they find families worthy of their light. My son, Harry, is a different man. The boyish, easygoing light in his eyes is gone, replaced by a quiet, somber gravity. The betrayal cut him to the core, and some days I see him staring off into the distance, lost in the memory of a life he thought he had. But he is not broken. He is healing. He has poured every ounce of his being into being a father. He reads to Julia for hours, his voice a soft, soothing rumble. He knows the exact way to hold her to make her stop crying. He is fiercely protective, endlessly patient, and profoundly loving. The love he had for Rebecca was a blinding, naive thing. The love he has for his daughter is a deep, knowing, and unbreakable bond. Our own relationship has been forged anew in the fire of that ordeal. We don't need to speak of it often. The understanding between us is now a quiet, constant presence. As for me, the quiet, sometimes lonely grandmother who used to watch the world from her kitchen window is gone. In her place is someone I am still getting to know. Someone stronger, warier, someone who has stared into the face of true evil and refused to blink. I no longer dismiss my own intuition. I no longer fear the darkness that can hide behind a beautiful smile. I have learned the true meaning of the word protector. Julia coos in my arms and pats my cheek, pulling me from my thoughts. I smile, kissing the top of her head, breathing in her sweet, baby scent. I look out at the lake. It is no longer a tomb. It is no longer a place of horror. The water holds the memory of that terrible day. I know it always will. It is a permanent scar on the landscape of my life. But as I look at it now, holding my true, beautiful granddaughter close to my heart, I don't feel fear. I feel peace. We survived. We endured. And here, in the quiet stillness of our new beginning, we found our way back to the light.